Hello, my name is Sarah Seifert, and I am a student in HUM 1211 CRN 30476 for the summer term 2015, and my topic for the final project was Gothic churches and the influence of religion in the artwork. Since there was such a wide array of topics that could possibly be covered, I focused on the topics of sculpture, stained glass windows, and illuminated texts. So you have to ask, what is the purpose of art in churches at all? And this is what I will be asking when I change topics, and I like to know why. What is the deeper meaning? What is the purpose of art in churches at all? So in Gothic times, most people were illiterate. Those who could read in the modern language also required the skill of reading in Latin to be able to read religious texts. And not everybody had this skill. Just because you could read didn't mean you could read religious texts. And I like to use humor in my presentations. I think it makes something that a lot of people could find very dry, a little more fun, and a little more interesting. The fact that people couldn't read religious texts because they were in Latin didn't change until hundreds of years later with Martin Luther and the Reformation. The church believed that to have scripture written in anything other than Latin was blasphemous, and it just wasn't done. So lay people relied on their translation of scripture from the clergy and from their ministers. So the intricate artwork in churches served as more than just something to look at while a minister preached. It was a way of helping the clergy teach lay people about the Bible. Now, when you say that religion had an influence on the artwork of Gothic churches, it seems like a no-brainer and kind of a misnomer. I mean, it's a church. It's the center of religious worship in Gothic times, so how could religion not have an influence? How could it not? It's not that it didn't have an influence. What is the deeper meaning? What is the deeper influence that religion and spiritualism had on the art in Gothic churches? Why would Gothic artists choose the themes of sculpture, light, and gold in churches? In the Byzantine styles and in the Byzantine churches and associated times, the use of sculpture was a massive topic of debate. Most clerics saw that sculpture was a graven image, and it was in clear contradiction to the second commandment found in Exodus 24, forbidding the practice. You can take, for example, Hagia Sophia. It's a Byzantine church. This favors the Byzantine style of two-dimensional mosaics, just flat mosaics with very stoic faces. So after the great debate was settled, many hundreds of years later, Gothic art was born in the church. And Gothic art began to embrace a little more of a secular focus than its Romanesque predecessor. So sculptures in the church in the Gothic period still had popular focuses of stories like Adam and Eve and Daniel in the Lion's Den and popular things like biblical individuals and angels and saints. But the Gothic churches seem to embrace a little bit more of the beauty of real life than the Romanesque period did. Like if you look at this picture of the Madonna and the Christ child, they favor a little bit more, and the next two slides you'll see, they favor a little bit more the Byzantine style where they're really stoic, they don't have a whole lot of detail in their face. But you can see the beautiful folds in the Madonna's dress and the detail in her hands and in the feet of the Christ child. This is King Charles IV, and again, he, very stoic. He doesn't have too much of a change in expression on his face. There's really no detail in his eyes. And he didn't have a whole lot of emotion, again, influenced by the Byzantine style. And this is more about how the clerics and lay people learned about the scripture. This is the Annunciation at Notre Dame. And you can see, again, not a lot of detail in the faces. The eyes are blank, but beautiful detail in the chin, in the wings of the angel here. And this was where you're seeing the statues and the sculptures are becoming more freestanding. They look more human. They took on more of a human form. So why did the sculptors begin to do this? Sculptures in the Gothic times became a way to see in a temporal and familiar form the divine, making it something palpable, touchable, easy to associate. It was a way of reaching out and touching it, of putting a name with a face, and being able to look at, when you heard the story of Daniel and the Lion's Den, you could look and see the sculpture and put it together for lay people who could not read it in the Bible. Now, another way that they put names with faces was the use of stained glass. And stained glass windows became popular during the mid-12th century. A priest named Abbot Seguer, and I really hope I'm saying that name right, of St. Denis, has been called the father of stained glass. The process of creating stained glass, even in modern times, is still popular, but it's incredibly arduous, and it was more so back in medieval times. The first step was to make like a potash of elements, such as wood and ash and metal. And you boil this all down, and then you turn it into molten glass. Now, once you had the molten glass, you would take it and you would blow it out into shapes, and it came in two shapes. You either put it into a sheet or you blew it out into these long, almost sausage-looking tubes that were later cut up. Here was the big Gothic problem with making stained glass, and it still exists today. In order to be able to make the beautiful colors that came with stained glass, and even still, you had to deal with really heavy metals, and metals that we know today are incredibly toxic. Metals like cobalt and lead and arsenic and mercury and cyanide. We still, to this day in 2015, use these metals to make stained glass. There's just not a good way of doing it. And while they produce beautiful hues, it was very dangerous work to make this stained glass. And these are the beautiful hues that are brought out. This is what the stained glass would look like once it was finished and chopped down and ready to be used. So once you cooled down the glass and you've chopped it all down and you've got it in the pieces that you're going to use, the glass was arranged on a pattern that had been drawn out on a piece of paper. And it was arranged into lead canes and waterproofed with putty, and then it was hung into an iron frame. So why go through this time-consuming process when they already had the process of mosaics, which also created a two-dimensional figure, down? Why go through it? Why deal with the poisonous metals? Why go through the time-consuming work? Why? Why do it? The answer comes back to Abbot Seguir, and I really hope I'm saying his name right. He had a conjecture that by using stained glass, it allowed light into the church. In the Christian faith, divine light is a very common theme. You see divine light from in the beginning, and when they talk about in the beginning in the book of Genesis, that the earth was dark and it was void, and one of God's first acts was to say, let there be light. So light has a very deep meaning in the Christian faith. Even when you read about the baptism of Christ in the book of Matthew, it talks about God's divine light descending in the form of a dove. So by allowing light in and using glass to allow that light in, it's a symbol of God's divine presence in the church. And usually what was the focus of stained glass windows were religious figures, and it was God's illumination on them. So this is going to move us on to our last topic, which is going to be illuminated text. Illuminated texts focus a lot on that common theme in Christianity and in Christian faith of God's divine light. So during this era, most books were used by the clergy for liturgical purposes, which is like doing mass and teaching out of the Bible and prayer books. That's what books were mostly used for. But in the 12th century, the early 12th century, books began to be produced for individuals as well as churches and monasteries. In Gothic times, churches, as well as the very wealthy, began to have these books that had artwork in them called illuminated manuscripts. This is an example of an illuminated manuscript. This is Mary Magdalene telling the 12 disciples about the resurrection. And what an illuminated manuscript is a book that contains intricately embellished artwork, usually in gold and very rarely in silver. And in the next slide, I'll show you a silver illuminated manuscript. This is a picture of the Madonna, and she's illuminated in silver, and it's very uncommon to see silver illuminated manuscripts. And the point of using gold or silver in the manuscript was that it made the artwork appear to be lit up or illuminated. And like I said before, I actually like to use a little bit of humor in my presentations just to kind of spice things up. There is a modern reference in a really unusual place to an illuminated text, even in modern times, and that is in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So when Indiana Jones gets through the train scene and he has the Cross of Coronado and he runs in to tell his dad, Dad, I got the Cross of Coronado. And his dad ends up sending him away. Dr. Jones, senior, not junior, is studying an illuminated text in his quest for the Cup of the Covenant that he's copying and putting into his journal. And after the interruption by the young Indiana Jones, he says, May he who illuminated this illuminate me. So see, you take a college humanities class and you have a better understanding of modern films. It's all a win-win. A major reason that illuminated texts have a religious theme date back to the burning of the Library of Alexandria in the 5th century. Documents that survived this travesty to human history were very difficult to come by, and they were usually brought to monasteries for duplication and preservation. Thus, the Bible was one of the most replicated pieces of work. And the monks who mastered this art form worked in a room called a scriptorium. This was an art form that you really had to go and you had to learn. And there were special monasteries that were just set aside for monks who specifically did illumination. And you did not start out as an illuminator. There were processes that you went through to be an apprentice as a young monk, and you went on before you could become an illuminator. And the monks who mastered this art form worked in a room called a scriptorium. And in scriptoriums, you were only allowed to be in there if you were actually doing the work in the scriptorium. Since paper was not widely available until the 1400s, these monks developed a special system of treating animal skins with lye, and lye again was when you took wood ash and you washed it out, that treated the skins. And then these skins were taken and they were cut into pages. So when you were becoming an illuminator, one of the first jobs you had was lining the pages so that the monks or the later on people who did script work had a steady line to write on. They ruled it in red lines, and then a sticky substance, which was usually a sap or kind of refined red clay, was placed on the page so the illuminator could go in and continue his work. So these are what the illuminator would use. They would apply like a full page of like gold leaf or other paints. And these materials were made up from crushed stones and ground minerals, plant dyes, and even chemicals that they used to put together, and they were applied to the page. But here we go again with why. Is there a deeper significance to using the color gold? Gold was a representation of physical light. It has a symbolic significance as divine light. When artists would use gold, they would use gold as a way of expressing divine illumination because of gold's light reflecting properties. So it wasn't used merely for decoration, but it was used to express an otherworldly light and spiritual illumination. The use of gold is common in religious works. Let's go back to the mosaics of Hagia Sophia. The mosaic tiles are embellished with gold, and the halos in religious figures are embellished in gold. If you look closely, this is a mosaic of Christ. And down here in the corner, you can see the gold embellished tiles. By using these elements, it's a way of inspiring people and expressing divine light and God's presence in religious figures and in churches. I'd like to thank you so much for listening to my presentation on Gothic churches. And this is my list of works cited. And I've had a wonderful semester. Thank you so much.